I'm going to have a conversation with a well-known political leader, activist, mother, and a personality in South Africa's public life, Ms. Helen Zille, the Premier of the Western Cape and formerly leader of the DA. She's just published a book. It's titled, Not Without a Fight. What a title for Helen Zille. I was thinking, could it have been called anything else except Not Without a Fight? I said, it's not too far from her personality, Helen Zille. And a pleasure to be with you.
Great, lovely to be with you.
Much appreciated. And thanks for joining us in the Republic of Gauteng.
Well, it's a DA Republic too now.
Oh, I can see that it's working towards that,
yes.
it appears. But coming back to the current public issues that are of concern to many of us, before I even talk about the Minister of Finance, who's giving his midterm budget vote today. Let's talk about the President's remarks. Yesterday he said that Parliament should be moved from Cape Town to Pretoria. What did you make of that statement when you heard it?
He often says that when he wants to divert attention away from the crisis that he's facing. This must be about the fourth time he said it. Now, let's do a cost-benefit analysis. Let's look at the serious numbers. Will it make sense financially? Will it be cost-effective for the country to move or to stay where it is? And I'm prepared to look at the numbers and the figures, and then we can take the conversation forward on the basis of evidence, not on the basis of emotion.
Do you think it's a serious proposal on his part?
Yes, I do think it's a serious proposal, but I also think it's a diversionary tactic. And it's certainly a proposal that needs to be debated. I think it makes sense to have a balance across the country, the administrative capital in Pretoria, the judicial capital in Bloemfontein, and the legislative capital in Cape Town. That makes a lot of sense, and if we want to change it, let's see what benefit or not that change will bring.
It wasn't a surprise to you, I suppose, when you heard him say or suggest that?
No, he suggested that in the State of the Nation address earlier this year, so it comes now and again.
This whole notion of state capture, which is at the center of this, it's not really Pravin Gordhan, the person that everyone is concerned with, but there's a link between what is going on around him and the reports of the state capture as investigated by the public protector, whose report has not been made public. The whole matter of state capture and the fact that the Gupta family is implicated in that and that there is a connection to the president. What is your, as an old hand in politics and somebody who's always been concerned about the abuse of power, what is your reading of this?
Well, my reading of it is that in any transition to democracy, if one party becomes too powerful, it tends to see the institutions of state as its own tools, as its own mechanisms, rather than institutions set up by the Constitution to hold leaders to account and to prevent them from abusing their power. So already under President Mbeki's watch, you saw the battle over the National Prosecuting Authority. You saw Vusi Pikoli stand up very firm against first President Mbeki and next President Motlanthe to say, I'm independent and I have to prosecute without fear or favor. And he was fired twice by two different presidents for defending the independence of state institutions to stop power abuse. So we saw then already the attempt by politicians to capture the National Prosecuting Authority and turn it into a tool of their power. That's not supposed to happen. The judiciary is supposed to be independent, the prosecuting authority is supposed to be independent, the police and the army are supposed to be independent, the electoral commission is supposed to be independent, the public protector, the human rights commission, njalo njalo. They're all supposed to be completely independent of political power in order to hold power to account and prevent corruption. And this started eroding because the ANC became so very, very powerful. And Jacob Zuma moved with particular speed to capture state institutions and was very popular, and then the Guptas saw their gap. They could see that if they could capture Jacob Zuma, they could capture the state, and that's what we saw happening. Because Jacob Zuma had extended his power into controlling those institutions. All that had to happen after that was that the Guptas had to capture Zuma with financial leverage, and that's what we've been seeing.
So you reckon that the president is captured by the Guptas?
Yes, I do think that the president's been captured by the Guptas a very long time ago. I think that they have shown that they're prepared to offer lots of money for people to abuse their political influence. when Modise Jonas revealed, as it's been reported, allegedly and certainly not denied as yet, that Modise Jonas was offered 600,000 rand by the Guptas to accept becoming Minister of Finance, and then an incredible amount of money to work together with the Guptas. It shows me just how much they thought they could get away with. That's clearly what they've done with President Zuma. Paid him for using his political connections in their favor, and they thought they could just extend that influence across the cabinet, and especially in the Treasury, to take away the last resistance against their drive towards the nuclear deal.
I'll come back to the current issues in a moment. Let's talk about your book, Not Without a Fight. And listening to you now talk about the abuse of power, it is something that has defined your life, whether intentionally or in an unintended manner, because even your family, for them to settle here in South Africa and you to be raised in Joburg and now Premier of the Western Cape, it's got to do with abuse of power at some point. And
yes,
it must be something that's very, very important to you. So it takes me back to the Holocaust, the Second World War, and the fact that it dispersed so many people after the terrible tragedy of millions of people being persecuted and killed. And you are a product of that. You know, if you can take me back to the time and,
yes,
and what it means to you, this abuse of power.
Well, I was born in Johannesburg and in 1951, and that was shortly after the Second World War ended, when lots of my family were murdered in Germany. And my parents were lucky, they escaped. They were refugees and came to South Africa and had to start their life again with obviously nothing at all. And they raised us with a very strong consciousness of fairness, of justice, of the rule of law, of the rule of just law. And they made it quite clear to us that no society could ever succeed without justice and without a fair system in which power was held to account. And they'd seen the devastation of their country and their lives and their families through an abuse of power. And they raised us to fight power abuse here too.
And of course, when you grew up and became a student activist and became a journalist, I see a common thread, you know, everywhere, and including when you lived in Cape Town, that there's some activism of sorts that's going on throughout.
Yes, I think it was very important in my family history to stand up against injustice. And there was plenty of injustice in South Africa when I was growing up at the height of apartheid. And my mother joined the Black Sash very early on. My father had been a member of what was then known as the Springbok Legion, which was very strongly opposed to apartheid. And they stood up and made as much noise as they possibly could at the time. And so I grew up with that.
Are there particular individuals during your university days that even went on to make a bigger impression on you in terms of standing for justice? I mean, compared to the teachings and lessons that you got from your folks?
Well, I suppose when I was a young student and I initially joined NUSAS, Steve Biko broke away from NUSAS and started South African Students' Organisation, SASO, if I remember well at the time, and had a very big critique of the non-racial struggle, which was a problem for him, and I had a lot of grappling to do with that particular concept. So that had a big influence on my life. Many other things did, but certainly I was swept away by the idea that we had to fight for democracy in South Africa, and it's still what motivates me today.
You know, I'm sometimes taken aback by people who do not know your history up to the extent of what you did in the 70s. As a journalist doing her work, doing her job, that you actually brought the facts about Steve Biko's death to light. And it's a matter that could easily have been swept away. And I recall myself as a very young man then, I followed the coverage of the inquest very religiously. And I was not aware that the Helen Zille, who was responsible for that, is somebody I'll get to know in time. So I've never told you the story, so I'm telling you now.
Thanks,
that
Tim.
I followed the coverage in the Rand Daily Mail.
Thanks, Tim.
And it's one of the things that made me realize the importance of journalism, as well as reporting the truth and uncovering the facts for people, that it's very, very important because it influences the course of events. So just tell me about that time what transpired, what happened, how you chanced on or you came across the information, and your commitment to making sure that the story of Steve Biko was told, which to many people who were younger, they got to know who Steve Biko was about as a result of that coverage.
Well, thanks, Tim. I had a very good editor at the time, Alistair Sparks, and he was very courageous. And I remember when the then Minister of Justice, Dr. J.T. Kruger, announced that Steve Biko had died after going on a hunger strike. And of course, we didn't believe him. And Alistair said we absolutely had to find the truth of this. And eventually the pathologist gave Alistair the report which showed that he'd done an inquest and showed that Steve Biko died of brain damage. But the pathologist said we couldn't tell anybody that he had given us this information. So we sat with this information, but we had to get it from a different source because otherwise our source would have been exposed. And so I had to go down to Port Elizabeth and investigate there. And I went and spoke to all the doctors who had seen Steve Biko. I tried even to interview the police at the Walmer police station where he'd been taken into custody and where he'd been so severely injured. And eventually, from all the questions I asked, we were able to deduce that Steve Biko was overweight when he died. He was not dehydrated when he died. So he could not have died of a hunger strike. And then, using the cover of all of the doctors' interviews that we'd had, we'd said all the indications were that he'd died of brain damage. Because we'd interviewed enough people by that stage to prevent it being traced back to our original source. Mm. So that's how we exposed the story.
And to a large extent, one would say it defined your journalistic career, but I suppose there are other stories that stand out for you during that time, yeah?
There are many stories that stand out for me. I mean, I covered the Cele Commission of Inquiry into the Soweto uprising and had to go all over the country covering for that. I covered many, many big stories, and I went as far as Malawi and Zambia covering stories. I covered part of the Chimurenga in Zimbabwe, so I had big stories to cover.
But then, you know, journalists somehow, many of them, people who work in the media, we believe that that becomes a lifelong career. You don't quit and do something else once you work in that environment.
Yes, I know. I love writing. That's why I'm still writing today.
Yes.
But look, my editor, Alistair Sparks, was fired, and I was furious about that because they were clamping down on us for being so politically outspoken. And then that took away my purpose, you know, and I thought I'll go back to university, study a bit and see. And that's what I did. And then I became very involved in political activism. Black Sash, In-Conscription Campaign, Open City Initiative, all of those things.
Helen Zille is talking to us, and we are talking about current issues, talking about her life story, and this is the story that is now captured in a book called Not Without a Fight, and we'll continue our conversation with her in a moment.